Cold War did not feel like a war to most of the people living inside it. That is the first thing that needs to be understood before anything else can be said about it. It did not feel like the wars that came before it, the ones with beaches and trenches and bodies counted in public. It did not announce itself with declarations or uniforms visible from a distance. It moved through bureaucratic channels and classified memoranda, through funding allocations that appeared nowhere in any public budget, through the professional silence of men who had signed documents promising not to speak about what they had seen or participated in. For 46 years, the two largest military powers in recorded human history pointed weapons at each other that were capable of ending organized civilization within 30 minutes, and the populations living under those weapons were, for the most part, not permitted to know the full details of what was being aimed in their direction or on their behalf. What gets called the Cold War's relative peacefulness is a retroactive interpretation. It is the kind of meaning that gets assigned to events after they resolve without catastrophe. At the time, inside the institutions managing these weapons and these programs, the understanding was different. The understanding was that catastrophe was not a remote possibility being guarded against from a safe distance. It was something that had to be actively, continuously, and sometimes frantically prevented, and the prevention was never guaranteed, and the people doing the preventing were aware of that fact every working day of their professional lives. There were programs during this period that were not simply aggressive or dangerous in the ordinary sense of those words. There were programs that were conceptually unstable, that built instability into their operational design, that functioned by making the possibility of total destruction credible enough that the other side would believe it, and that in making that possibility credible, also made it real, also made it executable, also made it something that could happen through error as easily as through intention. Some of these programs were cancelled. Some were cancelled because they worked too well. Some were cancelled because the people overseeing them recognized that what they had built could not be controlled in the way that had been assumed when it was designed. Some were cancelled because something almost happened that was not supposed to happen, and the people who understood what had almost happened decided that the program could not continue without changing the probability of that thing happening again into something unacceptable even by the standards of the Cold War. What follows is an account of 19 of those programs. Not all of them are equally well documented. Some exist primarily in declassified documents that were released decades after the fact, in some cases after the people who ran them had died, in some cases after the governments that ran them had ceased to exist in their original form. Some are partially documented, with significant sections still classified or simply lost. What they share is the characteristic that defines this particular category of Cold War activity. They were programs that had to stop because continuing them meant accepting a level of risk that even the Cold War's institutional logic could not accommodate. The first of these programs began not with a weapon, but with an aircraft, and not with a specific operational plan, but with a general strategic problem that the United States Air Force was trying to solve in the early 1950s. The problem was this: the Soviet Union had an enormous landmass, and that landmass contained military and industrial targets that needed to be reachable by American bombers in the event of a nuclear war, and the bombers of the early 1950s did not have the range to reach all of those targets from bases in the continental United States or from the forward bases in Europe and Asia that were available at the time. The Air Force needed something with longer range, or it needed something that could fly so far that it could reach any point on the Soviet landmass without stopping. The program that emerged from this requirement was the nuclear-powered aircraft program, and what makes it relevant here is not the aircraft itself, which was never successfully built, but what the attempt to build it revealed about the assumptions the Air Force was making about acceptable risk. The concept was straightforward in its outline. A nuclear reactor, miniaturized enough to fit inside an aircraft, could theoretically power jet engines indefinitely. An aircraft with a nuclear power plant would not run out of fuel. It could stay airborne for days or weeks if necessary. It could fly to any point on the Earth's surface and return. It could loiter over target areas waiting for orders. The range problem would be solved permanently. The program that was assigned to develop this aircraft was called the Aircraft Nuclear Propulsion Program, and it ran for approximately 14 years, from 1946 to 1961, and consumed somewhere in the range of $1 billion in mid-century money. And it never produced an aircraft that flew under nuclear power. What it produced instead was an increasingly detailed understanding of why the concept was extremely difficult to execute safely. The reactor that would power such an aircraft would be operating in a mobile environment, subject to vibration, temperature changes, and the mechanical stresses of flight. If the aircraft crashed, the reactor would crash with it. A crashed nuclear reactor in an uncontrolled environment presented problems that were not primarily about the explosion, because the reactor was not a bomb, but about contamination, about the dispersal of radioactive material across whatever landscape the aircraft came down in. The engineers working on the program became progressively more aware that the aircraft they were trying to build, if it ever flew and then failed mechanically, would constitute a radiological event of significant scale wherever it came down, and that this could not be entirely engineered away because the fundamental physics of the situation was that nuclear material in a crashing aircraft was going to go somewhere, and somewhere was always going to be a problem. The program was cancelled in 1961 by the Kennedy administration, partly on technical grounds and partly because the intercontinental ballistic missile had by that point provided a different solution to the range problem, one that did not require a crew. The official termination was framed in efficiency terms. The underlying reason was that what had been built was a program for creating a flying radiological hazard with no reliable mechanism for preventing that hazard from manifesting when the aircraft eventually failed, and aircraft eventually fail. The second program exists in a different category of danger entirely, and it requires some context about how American nuclear strategy evolved in the late 1950s to be understood correctly. By 1958, the United States had thousands of nuclear weapons and a delivery system consisting primarily of long-range bombers operated by the Strategic Air Command. The Strategic Air Command, under General Curtis LeMay, had developed a culture and an operational philosophy that was oriented entirely around the ability to deliver those weapons quickly, decisively, and in overwhelming numbers. LeMay believed, and the institutional culture of his command reflected this belief, that the purpose of nuclear weapons was not deterrence in the sense of preventing war, but war fighting, in the sense of winning the nuclear exchange if it came, and winning it by hitting first, hitting hard, and hitting everything simultaneously. This philosophy produced a target list that was, by any measure, extraordinary in its scope. The document that eventually emerged from this planning process, the Single Integrated Operational Plan, or SIOP, contained thousands of designated targets in the Soviet Union and China and Eastern Europe, and it contemplated scenarios in which all of those targets would be struck simultaneously or near simultaneously, and the estimated casualties from the execution of this plan ran into the hundreds of millions. The plan was designed to function as a single integrated operation, meaning that it was not designed to allow for selective execution, for hitting some targets and not others, for proportionate response to specific provocations. It was designed to execute completely or not at all. What made this plan relevant to the present account is not its existence, which was known in outline to American policymakers, but what it implied about the decision-making process that would lead to its execution. The plan was designed to be executed quickly. The warning time available between the detection of a Soviet missile launch and the impact of those missiles on American territory was measured in minutes, not hours. If the president was going to authorize retaliation before American command and control infrastructure was destroyed, that authorization had to happen very fast. The plan was therefore designed around the assumption that rapid authorization was both possible and reliable, and that assumption was not tested against realistic scenarios until the early 1960s. when analysts at the Rand Corporation and elsewhere began to examine it seriously and found that it was not well-founded. The study that most directly threatened the PSYOP was conducted by a group of analysts who were given access to the actual command and control arrangements and asked to assess how reliably the authorization process would function under realistic nuclear attack conditions. Their conclusion was that the realistic answer to the question of whether the president could reliably authorize nuclear retaliation within the available time window under conditions of a Soviet first strike was not reliably. The communication links were vulnerable. The president was mobile and not always reachable. The chain of command had gaps that a sufficiently aggressive first strike could exploit. The PSYOP was a plan for executing a massive nuclear strike that depended on a command and control system that might not function reliably when the moment came. The response to this finding, rather than redesigning the plan to reduce its dependence on rapid high-level authorization, was to develop arrangements that would allow the plan to execute with less authorization rather than more. This is the direction the logic pointed, and following that logic led to the third program in this account, which was the development of pre-delegated authority arrangements under which nuclear weapons could be used by military commanders without explicit presidential authorization if certain conditions were met. Pre-delegation was not a secret in the sense of being unknown to senior policymakers. It was authorized at the highest levels and reflected a genuine strategic judgment that the alternative, which was a nuclear retaliatory capability that might not function because the president was dead or unreachable, was worse than the arrangement being created. But it produced a situation in which nuclear weapons could be used by individuals who were not elected officials and who were operating under conditions of enormous stress and incomplete information, and the controls on that authority were less robust than any public description of American nuclear policy suggested. The Eisenhower administration authorized pre-delegation. The Kennedy administration inherited it, was alarmed by what it found, and attempted to claw back some of the authority that had been dispersed. The attempts were partially successful. The arrangements that remained after Kennedy's revisions still contemplated scenarios in which nuclear use could occur without presidential direction if command and control links were sufficiently disrupted. The program was not cancelled so much as managed, and the management was imperfect, and the imperfection was acknowledged internally, but could not be publicly discussed because acknowledging it would have undermined the deterrent effect of the retaliatory capability it was designed to protect. The fourth program is more operationally specific and involves an incident that was classified for decades and is now known primarily through declassified documents released in the 1990s and through accounts by participants who were eventually permitted to speak. In January of 1961, a B-52 bomber carrying 2 Mark 39 thermonuclear weapons broke apart in flight over Goldsboro, North Carolina. Both weapons fell to the ground. One of them, on its way down, went through a sequence of arming steps that brought it to within one switch of detonating. That switch was a low-voltage thermal switch that was later found to be in the closed position, meaning it had activated when it should have. The reason the weapon did not detonate was that another component in the arming sequence had failed, and that failure prevented the final detonation signal from being sent. The weapon that came closest to detonating had a yield in the range of 3 to 4 megatons. The closest major population center was Goldsboro itself, but the detonation of a weapon of that yield in that area would have had effects extending across a significant portion of the eastern United States, with fallout patterns depending on wind conditions at the time. The classified assessment of the incident, written afterward by a weapons designer named Parker Jones, concluded that by the slimmest of margins, North Carolina had been spared nuclear catastrophe. The program that was effectively discontinued as a result of this and related incidents was the Airborne Alert Program, under which nuclear-armed bombers were kept continuously aloft, always flying, always ready to execute their strike missions without the delay that ground-based aircraft would have required. The Airborne Alert was maintained for years and was eventually curtailed after a series of accidents, of which Goldsboro was the most serious, but not the only one. The fifth program is connected to a different branch of nuclear weapons development and involves the Army rather than the Air Force. In the late 1950s, the United States Army developed a concept for battlefield nuclear weapons, weapons with small enough yields that they could be used against military targets in a European land battle without necessarily triggering strategic nuclear exchange. The weapons themselves were developed, and the program to deploy them, including artillery shells and short-range rockets with nuclear warheads, was implemented. What became problematic was not the weapons themselves, but the command arrangements for their use. Battlefield nuclear weapons were deployed with combat units. The officers commanding those units had custody of nuclear weapons that could be used against targets a few miles away. The authorization arrangements for their use were, by necessity, more decentralized than for strategic weapons, because a battlefield is a fast-moving environment, and the communication links available to a combat commander under fire are not the same as those available to a commander at a headquarters facility. The Army developed arrangements under which nuclear weapons could be released to tactical commanders under certain conditions, and those arrangements created a situation in which nuclear use in a European battle could potentially occur at a level far below strategic command, involving officers who were managing a specific tactical situation rather than thinking about strategic consequences. The recognition that this architecture was dangerous in ways that were not fully anticipated when the weapons were deployed led to a series of adjustments over the following decades, adjustments that were never complete and that left the fundamental problem of decentralized nuclear authority in a battlefield context only partially resolved. The tactical nuclear program was not cancelled, but it was progressively reduced. And the reduction was driven not by strategic reassessment alone, but by the growing recognition among the people managing these weapons that the command and control arrangements surrounding them were not reliable in the way that had been assumed. The sixth program takes the account into the domain of biological and chemical weapons, which were maintained alongside nuclear weapons throughout the Cold War, and which present a different kind of danger, one that is less immediately catastrophic than nuclear weapons, but in some ways more insidious. The United States Army maintained a large biological weapons program at Fort Detrick in Maryland from the Second World War through 1969, when President Nixon ordered the destruction of the American stockpile and the termination of the offensive biological weapons program. The termination was announced publicly and was genuine in the sense that the weapons were destroyed and the offensive program was ended. What was less clearly communicated was what had driven the decision. The official explanation emphasized American commitment to international norms and the belief that biological weapons were not useful military tools. The less official explanation, which emerges from documents declassified in subsequent decades, was that the program had become dangerous to manage in ways that its architects had not fully anticipated. Biological agents, unlike nuclear weapons, replicate. They can mutate. They can escape containment through mechanisms that are difficult to fully control. There had been incidents at Fort Detrick and at other facilities associated with the program. There had been accidents. There had been cases of worker exposure to agents that were not supposed to be released. There had been at least one case in which an agent had moved outside a facility in ways that were not entirely explicable and that raised questions about what the real containment record of the program had been. The decision to terminate the program was also influenced by a classified assessment of what would happen if the Soviet Union, which maintained its own large biological weapons program, chose to use such weapons against the United States. The assessment concluded that the United States had no effective defense against a sophisticated biological attack and that maintaining an offensive capability did not provide deterrence in the way that nuclear weapons did, because the attribution problem with biological weapons was sufficiently complex that retaliation could not be reliably directed and therefore could not be credibly threatened. The program was terminated in part because it had become clear that it was dangerous to maintain and not reliable as a deterrent, which was a combination that had no strategic justification. The seventh program is less well documented than most of the others in this account because significant portions of it remain classified, but its outlines are known through a combination of declassified documents, congressional testimony, and investigative journalism. It involves the question of what would happen to American command and control during the period immediately following a Soviet nuclear strike. Specifically, the question of how nuclear retaliation would be authorized if the normal chain of command had been destroyed or disrupted. The answer that was developed to this question involved the creation of survivable command systems, including airborne command posts, hardened underground facilities, and communication systems designed to function after nuclear detonations. These systems were real, and some of them are still operational. But the question that proved most difficult was not how to communicate during a nuclear war, but who would be authorized to order retaliation if the president and the constitutional successors were dead. The answer that was developed, which was partially formalized in classified directives and partially left in a state of deliberate ambiguity, involved arrangements under which certain military commanders would be authorized to execute the war plan if they determined, under specified conditions, that the United States was under nuclear attack and that no authorizing authority was reachable. The arrangements were designed to ensure that deterrence remained credible even if American leadership was destroyed in a first strike. They succeeded in that purpose. They also created a situation in which nuclear war could potentially be ordered by individuals who were not accountable to any civilian authority under conditions of extreme stress and incomplete information, with no possibility of consultation and no mechanism for the kind of deliberate decision-making that nuclear use ostensibly required. The eighth program involves not the United States but the Soviet Union, and it is known to Western audiences primarily through the account provided by Stanislav Petrov, a Soviet military officer whose actions in September of 1983 became significant enough to be discussed publicly after the end of the Cold War. Petrov was an officer at a Soviet early warning facility called Serpukhov 15, and on the night of September 26, 1983, the Soviet satellite early warning system reported that the United States had launched a missile strike against the Soviet Union. The report was specific. The system indicated that 5 intercontinental ballistic missiles had been launched from American territory. Petrov's job within the Soviet command structure was to report this detection to his superiors, who would then pass it up the chain of command to the leadership, where the decision about response would be made. The Soviet system was not designed so that Petrov himself would make any decision about response. But Petrov made a decision that was not formally within his authority, which was the decision not to report the alert as a genuine attack. He judged, on the basis of reasoning that he later described as partly instinctive and partly analytical, that the alert was a false alarm, and he reported it as such. His reasoning was that a genuine American first strike would not consist of 5 missiles, because 5 missiles would not be a strategically rational opening salvo given the scale of Soviet retaliatory capability. An American first strike, if it came, would involve hundreds or thousands of missiles simultaneously, not 5. The satellite system, he concluded, was malfunctioning. He was right. The system had detected reflected sunlight from high-altitude clouds as missile launches, a technical error that had not been previously identified as a failure mode. What Petrov's account revealed about the Soviet system was not that individuals exercising unauthorized judgment sometimes prevented catastrophe, though that is one reading of it, but that the system had been designed in a way that created the conditions under which such unauthorized judgment could become necessary. The early warning system had a known false alarm problem. The command procedures were designed to respond quickly to early warning indications. The combination produced situations in which the space between a false alarm and a retaliatory launch was occupied not by systematic verification, but by the judgment of whoever happened to be on duty. The 9th program is the American equivalent of this problem, and it manifests in the history of the NORAD early warning system and the multiple false alarms that occurred during the Cold War in the American system. The most significant of these, from the standpoint of how close it came to producing an actual response, occurred in November of 1979 and again in June of 1980. In November of 1979, a technician at NORAD headquarters in Colorado mistakenly loaded a training tape simulating a massive Soviet nuclear attack into the operational computer system. For approximately 6 minutes, NORAD's displays showed an attack in progress. Air defense fighters were scrambled, and the watch officer at the National Military Command Center in Washington was notified that a large-scale Soviet attack appeared to be underway. The error was identified before any retaliatory action was taken, because personnel were able to check the satellite detection systems and found that the satellites were not confirming the attack that the computer was displaying. But the incident revealed that the American command and control system had a vulnerability that had not been fully appreciated. The system could be made to display an attack that was not occurring, and the procedures for verifying whether an attack was real were not so robust that a false alarm would be reliably distinguished from a genuine attack within the time available. In June of 1980, there were 2 separate false alarm incidents within 3 days of each other, both caused by a faulty computer chip that was generating erroneous attack display data. On the morning of June 3rd, duty officers at NORAD and the National Military Command Center were informed that a small number of Soviet submarine-launched ballistic missiles were in flight toward American territory. Minutes later, the number changed to 200. Bomber crews were placed on alert. Then the alert was cancelled when it became clear that the satellite detection systems were again not confirming what the computers were displaying. The program that was effectively discontinued as a result of these incidents was not the early warning system itself, but the specific architecture under which raw computer outputs were treated as operationally actionable without cross-referencing against multiple independent detection systems in real time. The subsequent modifications to the system were genuine improvements. They did not eliminate the possibility of future false alarms generating inappropriate responses, but they reduced it. The reduction was acknowledged internally as incomplete. The 10th program involves a category of weapons that was developed during the 1950s and 1960s, and that was eventually recognized as uniquely dangerous because of a characteristic that made it different from other nuclear weapons. It was designed to be used by individuals operating without direct supervision in environments where secure communication was not available against targets of their own identification. The weapon was the nuclear-armed landmine, sometimes called the atomic demolition munition, and the American program for deploying it involved placing these devices in locations in Europe and elsewhere where they would be detonated by teams of special forces soldiers in the event of a Soviet advance. The concept was that atomic demolition munitions could be used to create barriers, to destroy infrastructure, to deny terrain to advancing Soviet forces in ways that conventional explosive demolitions could not. The weapons were relatively small in yield compared to strategic nuclear weapons, but they were still nuclear weapons, and the command arrangements for their use were extraordinarily decentralized. The teams assigned to emplace and detonate these devices were small, operating behind enemy lines with limited communication capability. In practice, the arrangements contemplated situations in which the teams would make independent decisions about detonation based on their assessment of the tactical situation. There was also a British version of this program, which was even more straightforwardly alarming in its command arrangements. The British deployed a weapon called the Blue Peacock, which was a nuclear landmine designed to be buried in Germany and detonated in the event of Soviet invasion. The classified documents related to this weapon, released in 2004, revealed that the designers had been concerned about the weapon's electronics malfunctioning in cold German winters, and one of the proposed solutions was to house live chickens inside the weapon's casing, where their body heat would keep the electronics warm. The chicken solution was rejected, but the weapon itself was developed, and the program proceeded until it was cancelled in 1958 on grounds that were partly technical and partly related to the political difficulties of pre-positioning nuclear weapons on German territory without German government knowledge. The 11th program concerns the development of fractional orbital bombardment systems by the Soviet Union in the mid-1960s. A fractional orbital bombardment system, or FOBS, was a nuclear warhead delivery method that placed a weapon in a low Earth orbit and then brought it down on its target from the orbit rather than on a standard ballistic trajectory. The significance of this approach was that a weapon on a standard ballistic trajectory approaches its target from a direction that allows radar systems to track it and estimate its impact point with some reliability. A weapon delivered from orbit can approach from any direction, including from the south, which was a direction that American radar systems of the period were not designed to cover because the assumption was that Soviet missiles would travel over the North Pole. The Soviet FOBS program was real and it was deployed. The weapons were designed and tested. The program was eventually constrained by the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which prohibited the placement of nuclear weapons in orbit. But FOBS was technically a fractional orbit system rather than a weapon placed permanently in orbit, and the Soviet Union's compliance with the treaty's application to FOBS was ambiguous. The program proceeded, and the weapons were maintained in deployment until the early 1980s. What made the program significant from the standpoint of this account was not just the capability it created, but what that capability implied about the early warning system. If weapons could approach from the south, American early warning systems as configured did not provide reliable warning. The response to this gap was the construction of additional radar systems. But the construction of those systems took time, and during that time the gap existed. And during the time the gap existed, a FOBS attack would have provided substantially less warning than the already limited warning time associated with standard ballistic missiles. The 12th program is American in origin and involves a weapon system that was developed in the late 1950s and early 1960s, and that was eventually recognized as posing a particularly severe risk of unauthorized use. The weapon was called the Davy Crockett, and it was a recoilless rifle that fired a small nuclear warhead and was assigned to infantry units at the battalion level. The Davy Crockett was designed to be operated by a two-man team and to be used against Soviet armor concentrations and troop formations in a European land battle. It had a range of a few miles and a yield of roughly 10 to 20 tons of TNT equivalent, making it the smallest nuclear weapon ever deployed by the United States. The problem with the Davy Crockett was not primarily its yield, though a weapon that kills the crew operating it if they do not move quickly enough after firing presents obvious issues. The problem was the command and control architecture around it. At the battalion level, with weapons of this type distributed to infantry units, the practical authority to use them resided with officers who were not part of the strategic command structure and who were managing tactical situations in real time, without the ability to consult with higher command before making decisions. The authorization procedures existed on paper, but their practical enforceability in a combat environment was limited. The Davy Crockett was withdrawn from service in 1971. The official reason was that it had been made obsolete by improved conventional weapons and by changes in NATO tactical doctrine. The record suggests that the command and control problem was a significant factor in the decision to retire it. The 13th program involves the ocean rather than land or air, and it concerns the question of nuclear weapons on submarines. American and Soviet submarines carried nuclear weapons throughout the Cold War, and the command and control arrangements for submarine-launched nuclear weapons were different from those for land-based or air-delivered weapons in ways that were operationally significant. A submarine operates in an environment of communication silence. It cannot receive reliable communications when it is at depth and operating according to standard patrol procedures. This means that a submarine on nuclear patrol is, for significant periods, effectively incommunicado. The arrangements that were developed to address this created a specific type of risk. If a submarine's crew received a message ordering nuclear launch, there was no reliable mechanism for the submarine to verify that the message was authentic rather than a deception, and there was no reliable mechanism for higher authority to retract a launch order after it had been sent if circumstances changed. The procedures were designed to prevent false launches, and they included mechanisms that required multiple officers to agree before weapons were armed. But they could not prevent a situation in which a crew received a message, believed it to be authentic, and proceeded to launch without being able to verify the current state of the situation at the surface. The Able Archer 83 exercise in November of 1983, which was a NATO exercise simulating the transition to nuclear war, came closer to triggering a genuine Soviet response than was understood at the time by American planners. Soviet intelligence, watching the exercise, interpreted aspects of it as potentially being cover for an actual preparation for nuclear attack. Soviet nuclear forces were placed on elevated alert. The classified post-exercise assessment concluded that the exercise had generated a response that American planners had not anticipated, and that the procedures and communication patterns associated with the exercise had been interpreted in ways that were not intended. The program that was subsequently modified was not Able Archer itself, but the broader framework of large-scale NATO exercises that simulated nuclear transition, which were scaled back and redesigned to reduce their ambiguity to Soviet surveillance. The 14th program involves an aspect of Soviet Cold War planning that was not known to Western intelligence in its full dimensions until the late 1980s and early 1990s, when Soviet defectors and eventually former Soviet officials began to describe a system that had been developed in response to exactly the problem of decapitation strikes that American planners had been working on throughout the Cold War. The system was called Perimeter, and it was sometimes described in Western media after the Cold War as the dead hand, and it was designed to ensure that the Soviet Union could retaliate against a nuclear attack, even if its entire leadership and military command structure had been destroyed. The way Perimeter worked in its broad outlines as described by former Soviet officials was that it maintained a network of sensors monitoring for indicators of nuclear attack. If those sensors detected what appeared to be nuclear detonations on Soviet territory, and if certain command and control indicators showed that the normal chain of command was no longer functioning, the system would authorize the launch of nuclear weapons without human decision-making at the command level. There were human operators in the system, but the operators were located in hardened facilities, and their role was to confirm that certain conditions were met, rather than to make independent judgments about whether retaliation was appropriate. The system was designed precisely to create the kind of automated response that American planners had feared. It was a machine for ensuring nuclear retaliation that would function even if no human with the authority to order retaliation was still alive. It was the logical endpoint of the deterrence logic that had structured Cold War nuclear policy on both sides. If the credibility of retaliation is what prevents attack, and if the credibility of retaliation depends on demonstrating that retaliation will occur even if the leadership is destroyed, then the credible demonstration requires building a system that will actually retaliate automatically. Perimeter was not cancelled. It was modified over time as the technical components required updating, and former Russian officials have indicated that some version of it remained operational after the Cold War ended. The Soviet program that was discontinued was not Perimeter, but a specific aspect of its original design that was acknowledged to create risks of false activation, a problem that was addressed through modifications that reduced but did not eliminate the possibility of the system responding to non-nuclear events as if they were nuclear attacks. The 15th program takes the account into the domain of chemical weapons, which were stockpiled by both superpowers throughout the Cold War and which were used by proxy states in ways that neither superpower publicly acknowledged. The American chemical weapons stockpile was maintained in multiple locations, including storage facilities in Europe that were intended to support NATO forces in the event of a land war. The management of these stockpiles produced a series of incidents that were classified at the time and that revealed the difficulty of maintaining large quantities of extremely toxic material in a reliable state over long periods. The most significant of these incidents, from the standpoint of public knowledge, occurred in 1969 on Okinawa, which was at the time under American military control. An accident at a chemical weapons storage facility resulted in the exposure of a number of American servicemen and Okinawan civilians to nerve agent, and the incident eventually became known to Japanese media despite American efforts to contain the information. The revelation that the United States was storing chemical weapons on Japanese territory was politically significant because Japan had not been informed of this, and because Japanese public opinion was strongly opposed to the presence of nuclear or chemical weapons on Japanese soil. The program that was terminated as a result of this incident and of pressure from Japanese government officials who were confronted with the evidence of what had been stored on Okinawa was the forward deployment of chemical weapons in that specific location. The weapons were eventually moved, but the incident contributed to a broader reconsideration of the chemical weapons forward deployment program in Asia, which had been maintained under the assumption that local governments would not ask too many questions about what was being stored on their territory. The 16th program is one of the more unusual items in this account because it involves a weapon concept that was explicitly designed to cause long-term environmental damage rather than immediate destruction. The concept was developed in the United States in the context of the Vietnam War rather than strictly in the Cold War nuclear context, but it involved weapons technology that was being considered for potential use in a superpower conflict. The program was called Operation Popeye, and it was a weather modification program that used cloud seeding to increase rainfall over the Ho Chi Minh Trail in an effort to impede North Vietnamese supply movements. The program was real, and it operated for several years during the Vietnam War. It was classified, and its existence was denied by American officials when questions were raised. When it became known, it generated significant controversy, not primarily because of its effectiveness or lack thereof, but because of the precedent it established for environmental modification as a military weapon. The concern was that techniques developed for tactical weather modification could be developed further into strategic capabilities, creating the possibility of using climatological warfare against a superpower adversary. The international response to this concern eventually produced the Environmental Modification Convention of 1977, which prohibited military use of environmental modification techniques. The United States ratified this convention, which effectively ended the program as a matter of treaty obligation. The program had already been terminated before the treaty was concluded, following Senate investigations that revealed its existence in 1972. The 17th program involves the intersection of nuclear weapons and naval operations in a way that created a specific type of risk that was not fully appreciated until after the Cold War ended. Throughout the Cold War, American and Soviet naval vessels operated in close proximity, including attack submarines that tracked opposing strategic submarines on patrol. The procedures governing these tracking operations were designed to allow close approach without triggering weapon systems, but the procedures were imperfect, and there were incidents in which the tracking operations came close to results that were not intended. The program that came under scrutiny was the depth charge and nuclear depth bomb deployment on American anti-submarine warfare aircraft and vessels. American forces maintained nuclear depth charges for use against Soviet submarines, and Soviet forces maintained nuclear torpedoes on their attack submarines. The combination meant that a naval confrontation involving anti-submarine warfare could, under certain conditions, escalate to nuclear use in a way that was not connected to any decision at the strategic level. A ship captain or aircraft commander, responding to what appeared to be an aggressive submarine maneuver, could potentially use a nuclear weapon as part of a tactical anti-submarine response, and the conditions under which this might happen did not require authorization from any political authority. The incidents that are known to have come closest to this scenario involve Soviet submarines that were either tracked to the point of hostile response or that experienced internal emergencies that their crews interpreted as potentially involving external hostile action. The K-19 incident of 1961, in which a Soviet nuclear submarine suffered a reactor accident and its crew took actions to prevent what they feared was an impending catastrophe, was one such case. The B-59 incident during the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which a Soviet submarine under depth charge attack came very close to launching a nuclear torpedo, was another. The program of nuclear depth charges on anti-submarine warfare platforms was eventually modified to reduce the availability of nuclear weapons in tactical naval situations, a modification that was not announced publicly, but that was reflected in changed deployment patterns. The 18th program is associated with what may be the single most dangerous moment in the Cold War that is widely acknowledged as such. And it involves not a weapons program in the conventional sense, but a decision-making system that was operating during the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. The crisis is well documented compared to most of the events in this account, but the aspect of it that is most relevant here is one that received less attention in contemporary accounts than the diplomatic negotiations between Kennedy and Khrushchev. On October 27, 1962, which is the day that has come to be called Black Saturday by historians of the crisis, a number of events occurred nearly simultaneously that individually or in combination could have produced nuclear war. An American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft was shot down over Cuba. Another American U-2 accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace over Siberia and was intercepted by Soviet fighters. American destroyers tracking the Soviet submarine B-59 dropped practice depth charges, which the submarine's crew interpreted as an attack. The submarine's captain, Valentin Savitsky, ordered the nuclear torpedo armed and prepared for launch. What prevented the launch was the presence on board the B-59 of a senior officer named Vasily Arkhipov, who held a position equivalent to Chief of Staff of the submarine flotilla, and whose authorization was required for the torpedo to be released. Arkhipov refused to authorize the launch. The submarine surfaced. The crisis did not escalate to nuclear exchange on that day, in part because of this refusal. The program that was subsequently modified was the authorization structure for nuclear weapons on Soviet attack submarines, which was altered to require more explicit authorization from a higher level before tactical nuclear weapons could be used. The modification was driven by the recognition that the existing procedures had placed the decision about nuclear war in the hands of a submarine commander who was under depth charge attack, out of communication with his superiors, and operating under extreme stress with incomplete information about the overall state of the crisis. The 19th program in this account is in some ways the most contemporary and the most difficult to evaluate, because it involves systems that are not fully historical, but that have their origins in Cold War-era thinking and Cold War-era institutional arrangements. It involves the automation of nuclear warning and response systems to a degree that was not publicly discussed during the Cold War, and that is still not fully disclosed in either American or Russian official statements. The trajectory of Cold War weapons development was consistently toward automation, toward removing human decision-making from the path between detection and response, because human decision-making took time, and time was the one resource that the Cold War's operational logic consistently depleted. The missiles got faster, the warning times got shorter, the procedures got tighter, and at each step in this progression, the role of individual human judgment in the space between warning and launch contracted because the time available for that judgment contracted. The program that was developed in the 1980s to address this problem on the American side involved not automation of launch authority, but automation of the communication systems that would transmit launch orders, hardening those systems against nuclear effects and ensuring that they would continue to function after nuclear detonations destroyed the normal communication infrastructure. The system that was developed, known as the Minimum Essential Emergency Communication Network, was designed to ensure that authorized humans could still communicate launch orders under the most extreme conditions. The logic of this system was, by the standards of Cold War thinking, entirely rational. If deterrence depends on retaliation, and retaliation depends on communication, then communication must be survivable. But the system that was built to ensure survivable communication was also a system that ensured the physical infrastructure for nuclear use would remain functional after the social and political context that was supposed to govern nuclear use had been destroyed. It was a system for preserving the machinery of nuclear war past the point at which the civilization the machinery was supposed to protect had ceased to exist in any meaningful form. The program itself was not cancelled. Elements of it remain in operation. What was discontinued was a specific component of it that had been developed in the early 1980s, involving the deployment of a certain class of communication relay that was found to be vulnerable to a specific type of electromagnetic interference that had not been considered in the original design. The replacement for that component took several years to develop and deploy, and during that period, the survivable communication architecture had a gap that was acknowledged in classified assessments, but not publicly disclosed. What these 19 programs share, taken together as a group, is not a common technological theme or a common institutional origin. They were developed by different services, in different countries, under different strategic circumstances, and they addressed different operational problems. What they share is the quality of having been recognized, at some point in their existence, as having exceeded the boundaries of manageable risk, even by the standards of a period when manageable risk was understood to include the continuous possibility of total civilizational destruction. The Cold War ended in 1989 and 1991 through a series of events that were not primarily military: the collapse of communist governments in Eastern Europe, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the withdrawal of Soviet forces from their forward positions. The military systems that had been developed to manage the Cold War did not end with it. The weapons remained. The command and control arrangements, modified but structurally similar, remained. The automated systems remained. The communication networks designed to survive nuclear war remained. The institutions that had built and managed these systems remained, adjusted to new budgets and new doctrines, but carrying forward the organizational cultures and technical inheritances of the 46-year confrontation. The treaties that were negotiated during the Cold War and in its immediate aftermath reduced the numbers of weapons on both sides. The reduction was real. The weapons that were eliminated were eliminated. But the reduction did not address the fundamental architecture of the systems, which was designed around the assumption that deterrence required the capability for rapid, massive retaliation, and that this capability had to be maintained continuously, always ready, never fully stood down. That architecture did not change because the Cold War ended. It changed incrementally in response to budget pressures and treaty obligations and technological updates, but it did not fundamentally transform into something different in kind from what it had been. The 26,000 nuclear weapons that existed at the Cold War's peak have been reduced to several thousand across all states that possess them, and the two largest arsenals, American and Russian, have been reduced further by arms control agreements. The reduction is genuine. The systems surrounding those weapons, the early warning networks, the command and control infrastructure, the operational procedures, the institutional cultures, the professional military organizations whose identity is built around the management of these weapons, those systems persist. They have been adapted to the post-Cold War world. They have not been dissolved. The world in which they operate has changed. The systems themselves have not changed in the way that the change in the world might suggest they should have. The weapons are fewer. The systems are continuous.